Thank you. So I often give talks without notes, but today I am talking on Milton Avery's Vermont, which is based on an exhibition that I curated in 2016. And so I spent the last week reacquainting myself with the material, but so I don't mess up on facts and dates. I do have a script, but I'm also very open to engagement and conversation, so don't feel embarrassed to raise your hand or if you have a question or anything. I'm happy to stop where I am. I'll also probably ad-lib a little bit, but without any further ado, I'll just dive in. So between 1935 and 1943, the modern American painter Milton Avery, who was born in 1885 and died in 1965, spent 6 extended summer holidays with his family, his wife, Sally Michael Avery, and their daughter, March, in the small adjacent villages of Jamaica and Rawsonville, amidst the Green Mountains of south central Vermont. During an 8-year period, Avery regularly returned to these lushly forested hillsides and lightly farmed mountain valleys in search of visual stimulation for his insatiable creative appetite. This presentation, which as I already mentioned, is drawn from my 2016 exhibition and catalog of the same title, examines the full breadth of Avery's work based on his time in Vermont and explores the artist's creative process, allowing us to understand better his power of distillation and intuitive, emotive color sense. And I'll also say, with this big image on the screen and the image on my screen, Avery is an artist of color, and you have to see them in person to really get a full sense of them. You will never be able to fully capture their color on screen. So Avery's Vermont sojourns proved to be a pivotal chapter in the development of the artist's distinctive style, known for its extraordinary color and delicate balance between abstraction and representation. In Vermont, Avery captured summer activities with family and friends and developed his highly personal response to the landscape in works characterized by bold gestural marks and bright, non-associative colors. Avery's Vermont works exude a complete sense of peace and ease, capturing a relaxed, intimate atmosphere of holiday recreation and glorying in the eternal qualities contained in everyday activities like swimming and picnicking. Avery's depictions of modern life featured the Arcadian Vermont landscape and the leisure activities of a progressive middle class in the northeastern United States, escaping from the crush of city life and later a world at war. Always following his own path and never giving in to the popular trends, after decades of focused work and only moderate success, Avery achieved recognition and acclaim in the American art world at the very end of his most productive time in Vermont. A close examination of his work as it relates to Vermont helps us to appreciate more fully his rare contribution to the history of 20th century American painting. At first glance, this image seems like any other old family photograph, but as it turns out, the informal snapshot inscribed across the top image, Sally, Milton, March, Vermont, 35, is one of the few archival documents that connect the modern American painter Milton Avery to Vermont. The photograph establishes a particular place and mood. A relaxed Avery is seated in the grass, and his wife, Sally Michael Avery, an accomplished artist in her own right, and their 2.5-year-old daughter, March, on what looks to be a perfect summer afternoon. The image captures a moment during the first of at least 6 extended summer holidays between 1935 and 1943 that the Avery family spent in the West River Valley. These Vermont visits proved to be a pivotal chapter in the development of the artist's distinctive style. The main evidence documenting the Avery's time in the Green Mountains is the art that he created as a result of his extended summer holidays here. They spent, and we don't know exactly how long they spent each summer. We know he was certainly here for extended periods, as many as 3 months or more, at least some of the summers. But he spent extended stays in 1935, which we see here, 1936, 1937, took a year off in 1938, was back in 1939 and 1940, and then took 2 years off and was back in 1943. And based on the surviving works, surviving evidence, he was far and away most active in the summer of 1943, the last summer that he was here. And summer holiday, which is a term borrowed directly from the title of one of Avery's dry points, which we'll see later in this presentation, is a bit of a misnomer, for these visits sometimes extended from spring through summer into fall and hardly constituted a break from productive work. A notice in the October 11th, 1935 issue of the Vermont Phoenix, which was the local newspaper over there in Jamaica, notes, quote, "Artist and Mrs. Avery and little daughter March, who spent the summer at Miss Emma Franklin's, returned to their home in New York this week." Another notice in the October 13th, 1939 issue of the Vermont Phoenix newspaper indicates that the Avery family stayed in Jamaica for a few days earlier in the week, picnicking with a Mr. and Mrs. Kingsbury and their children at Townsend State Park. Likely the very event depicted in this painting by Avery at the upper left, the Picnic, Vermont, from 1940. A number of Avery's most successful paintings from his Vermont holidays portray Sally, March, and their friends swimming, sketching, or picnicking, and generally enjoying their rural surroundings. In this painting, the artist is easily identifiable as the figure in the left foreground. If I go back, you can see him with his mustache, and that's very clearly him leaning up against the birch tree there in the lower left. It's hard not to draw comparisons between the Picnic, Vermont, and Edward Manet's iconic early modern painting, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, from 1863, which we see at the bottom right. Avery was an assiduous student of art history, and the reference was surely intentional. In his famous essay, quote, The Painter of Modern Life, the publication of which was inspired in part by Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the French poet Charles Baudelaire wrote of, quote, "a painter of the passing moment and of all the suggestion of eternity it contains." By painting ordinary, everyday events like this picnic he shared with family and friends in the fall of 1939, Avery was able to achieve the eternal. The painting that we see on the screen is Fall in Vermont from 1935, based on that first summer fall visit to southern Vermont. The Averys probably discovered the Jamaica area through serendipity. Avery's earliest datable Vermont landscape is inscribed on the verso Vermont Road 1933. So we know he came here before 1935, but 1935 was his first extended stay. But that painting from 33 corresponds closely in date to Meyer Shapiro's purchase of a house on Goodaleville Road in Rawsonville in June of 1933. Shapiro was a highly esteemed critic and historian of modern art who worked and lived in the same circles as the Averys in New York City. It's tantalizing to surmise that it was Shapiro's ties to the isolated region that drew Avery to the area, though we have no hard evidence to prove it. We do know that the two families socialized together in Vermont. And while the Averys' destination may have been influenced by their relationship to the Shapiros, it certainly helped that it was a cheap place to spend extended holidays, with local residents renting out rooms inexpensively to make a little extra cash during the Depression. And it was surrounded by diverse, unending visual inspiration. Avery's first known extended stay in the Green Mountains in 1935 began with 3 weeks solid of rain. The discouragement that he felt seems to be reflected in the gray mood and atmosphere of his earliest works created here, such as Fall in Vermont, which we see on the screen, which is one of his brighter and more colorful works, actually, from this first summer. And in his Vermont oils from the mid-1930s, Avery applied paint relatively thickly, occasionally manipulating the still wet paint with the pointed end of his brush or even his fingers to create texture, pattern, and form. And it's really difficult to see in these reproductions, though you can see the technique in the short staccato horizontal lines incised through the wet paint to indicate foliage in the large red tree on the left of this painting, or the longer vertical lines indicating the bark of the tree's trunk. The density of paint in these early Vermont paintings may be a direct result of Sally and Milton Avery's precarious financial situation. Sally was an artist as well, and supported the family with her commercial illustration work. To save money on supplies, Milton painted a number of his early Vermont landscapes on recycled canvases that show evidence of earlier images scraped down and then painted over. In many cases, the artist turned economic necessity to aesthetic advantage, incorporating passages of the scraped pigment directly into the final image, or lightly brushing a thin layer of semi-transparent paint over the scraped surface, resulting in a subtle, complex optical mixing of colors, as we can see in the gray-green sky in the fall in Vermont. So if you can see up there, you're examining this painting, you're going, why is the sky green? Though I must admit, as I was about to come up here tonight, the star got green in Bennington. So he might have been thinking about that, but you can also see how it's a little difficult in this image how thick the pink paint is. He was trying to cover up the image behind it, which is why he was painting so thickly.
Was he using his own canvases, or was he using somebody else's work?
He would have been recycling his own canvases. I mean, and he used a lot of, I mean, he bought new canvases as well. But as I'll explain a little bit as we move along, he wouldn't have been painting any of those paintings here in Vermont. He sketched here in Vermont, and he created watercolors based on those sketches here in Vermont, but he would have then taken those works on paper back to his New York studio and completed the oils based on his sketches and watercolors, sometimes years after the fact. So this is his watercolor Swirling Brook from 1934, again, even before his first extended stay. And Avery's earliest Vermont watercolors parallel the oils from the same period, tending to an earthy, more opaque palette than his later works and a more naturalistic depiction of the landscape. Traits evidence in this work, which was a gift from the Avery Foundation to the Bennington Museum and is now part of our permanent collection. Not currently on view, but I will point out when you see images that are on view that you can come down and see in person. This painting, Vermont Rain, is from 1935, that first extended stay, which was memorably rainy here. And it seems to glory in the damp weather that he was experiencing at the time. Avery may have actually painted it out in the elements, the paper getting soaked before the watercolor was applied, resulting in the diffuse bleeding pigments in the sky and mountains at the right. So if anybody here is familiar with watercolor, oftentimes an artist will get the paper wet before they start, but they tend to let it dry out a lot or varied amounts in order to kind of achieve certain effects. But that really diffuse kind of bleeding effect that you see in the sky and the mountain on the right is from the paper being really wet. And I'm just conjecturing here, but it's possible he could have actually painted this in the rain, resulting in that effect. And then once the rain stopped and the sun came out, Avery was faced with another challenge, which he again turned to his advantage. Like other artists before him, Avery found Vermont, the Green Mountain State, too oppressively green, particularly during the summer after 3 weeks straight of rain. I just am thinking out loud and conjecturing, could this have helped him loosen his imagination, leading ultimately to his kind of use of non-associative colors and his kind of subtle exploration of the kind of variety of green that can be found here in the Green Mountains during the summer. This watercolor, Golden Autumn from 1940, is one of his kind of more vibrant, explosive colors. You'd think an artist like Avery, who is interested in color, might have painted the foliage a lot, but this is one of his rare fall foliage paintings, along with the earlier oil that I showed. But Avery wrote, he was a man of few words, but he did write at one point during his career that in the country, and he would go on summer vacations pretty much every summer with his family. He went to the West Coast at one point. He went to Mexico one summer. He went to Nova Scotia at some point during this period. He would spend summers in Woodstock, New York, and Providence, Massachusetts. So he was always going on vacation during the summer to get inspiration and find subject matters to paint. So in the country, I get up at 6 o'clock and do a watercolor before breakfast and 3 or 4 more during the day. And one of the relations for me in organizing the Avery exhibition was the sheer quantity and extraordinary strength of Avery's Vermont watercolors, which by themselves qualify him as one of the greatest practitioners of the medium in the 20th century. I worked closely with the Avery estate. His grandson, Sean Avery, runs the estate. He's also an artist. When I asked him about doing a Vermont exhibition, he was very enthusiastic. I went down and visited the estate in New York City, and I looked through hundreds of Vermont watercolors. So when he says he painted 2, 3, 4 watercolors a day, he wasn't joking. He really did paint that much. He has a light, seemingly improvisatory touch, often utilizing transparent washes and leaving raw white paper for highlights. He delights in patterns and the infinite possibilities of mark making. In his work like this, his watercolors from Vermont, we encounter an artist of the hand and the gesture. Abstract slashes and squiggles stand for shrubs, rocks, clouds, and different species of trees. The artist pushes relentlessly to see how far he can go in the direction of arbitrary mark making before it falls apart as representation. And I just love, we can explore a number of his watercolors to see, sometimes he would come up, I don't want to say formula because he was always kind of making it new, but in that lower right-hand corner, you can see what are likely dark green conifers of some sort. He seems to have devised little kind of shorthand mark-making strategies for certain species of trees, but he was clearly kind of playing with, again, kind of really wet, diffuse media to kind of capture that golden red brown hue. But then he used a very dry brush on that right-hand side of the mountain to capture that kind of the tips of the trees and on the shadow. The sun's obviously coming in from the left-hand side. So he really played with the variety of mark making. And you can always sense that he's very clearly basing his images on the real world, and he most definitely is, but he's playing with abstract mark making to kind of accomplish these wonderful images. Here's just a group of 4 more watercolors created during his time in Vermont. The one at upper left is called Forest at Sunset from 1943. At the upper right is Trees and Fields from 1943. At the lower left is Old Mountain from 1943. And Vermont Fall at the bottom right is from 1937. And that's actually one of a double-sided work on paper. Again, like when he recycled his canvases, if he didn't have enough paper, he'd just turn it over and paint another picture on the back. The watercolors are almost all 22 by 30, which are full-sized sheets of watercolor paper. So they're fairly large-scale works on paper. But again, he would sketch the scenes, and we'll see some of his drawings here shortly, and I'll talk a little bit more about his artistic process. But he would create these not necessarily on site, but back at his makeshift studio, wherever he was staying in Vermont at the time. But you can just see kind of the wide variety. You know, the one at the upper left with those kind of little squiggly brown tree trunks with the light coming through. That one really reminds me of Wolf Kahn. If anybody's familiar with the landscape painter Wolf Kahn, who spent a lot of time over in Brattleboro, Vermont. Wolf and the Averys were friends in New York City and knew each other quite well. So it's not surprising. Again, you can see another kind of way in which he approaches kind of the abstract construction of trees with the pine tree on the right with the kind of lighter green kind of just strokes to kind of articulate the branches, and then the darker green squiggles to get that kind of texture, or the blue shadows and the kind of raw white paper with black dots to create the sense of the bark on a white birch tree with the kind of fresh foliage, probably maybe a springtime image with that yellow-green foliage up at the upper left. Or in the lower left, how he just uses these kind of blotches of purple to indicate rocks up on the mountainside, craggy rocks. always exploring and using some kind of really expressive combinations of colors that you wouldn't necessarily see in nature. Basing it on his experiences, but not always being a slave to nature. So this is a watercolor titled The Swimming Hole from 1943. Again, a lot of these are from 43. He seems to have created tons of work during that kind of spring to fall period. And this is actually one of the works that you can see in the Bennington Museum's current exhibition, Parks and Recreation. The Averys rented a room from the Franklin family, no known relationship to me, on Water Street in Jamaica, just a short walk to what would become Jamaica State Park in 1969. Avery's work from his summers in Jamaica captures the atmosphere of holiday recreation and glories in the timeless qualities contained in everyday activities like fishing, swimming, and relaxing amidst the beauty of the West River Valley. Jamaica State Park is located on a bend of the West River, or Wanastitguk in Abenaki, meaning the place at the end of the river. The swimming hole depicts what is today known as Salmon Hole, which is a section of deep, slow-moving water that remains a popular public swimming area adjacent to the park's day-use parking lot. And during the summer, it's alive with families enjoying its cool waters and shade from nearby Ball and Little Ball Mountains. And when I was working on this project, I actually spent a weekend camping at Jamaica State Park in the summer of 2015. And one of the reasons I was able to definitively identify this as Salmon Hole is certainly the topography really makes sense. So that is the kind of rocky beach area. You can walk up to the parking lot. And the rock, that's a kind of a rock face that goes down into the water. He often painted the water in Jamaica a dark brown, which is true to form. For whatever reason, I think a lot of organic matter gets into the water there, and because it's slow moving right there, it turns the rocks and the water dark brown. But as I was exploring and swimming in this area, there's actually still a metal pin in the rock, which would have been the pin that held that wooden diving board there. So it's very much a very real place that you can still visit today. This is another work on view in our current exhibition, Parks and Recreation. It's an untitled work, which we're calling Fly Fisherman, from about 1937, so earlier in his Vermont period. And it's being seen for the first time after Avery's lifetime. I worked with the estate again to have it stretched, cleaned, and conserved for our exhibition. And the West River has been a favorite spot for fishing for millennia, with an excellent combination of swift-moving shallow areas and deeper pools of slow-moving water, which make it ideal for fishermen. And archaeological evidence indicates that the indigenous peoples fished here thousands of years before white settlers arrived in the area, and hence the name Salmon Hole, because salmon or inland trout often can be found spawning and in this area, and it's a very popular place even to this day for fly fishermen. This work is Sketches on Rock from 1943. Sally Michael and Milton Avery ate, slept, and breathed art. The hundreds of drawings and watercolors that Milton created in Vermont attest to this and underscore the fact that these summer holidays hardly constituted a break from productive work. This painting depicting Sally and daughter March sitting on a rock, sketching behind the home where they were staying. It's based on a drawing in one of the sketchbooks that Milton filled to capacity during the summer of 1943. And one of those sketchbooks from the summer of 1943 is on view in Parks and Recreation, and it shows them relaxing along the West River in what's now Jamaica State Park. Art making for the Averys was a family affair. Sally painted and did illustration and work. Their daughter March Avery Kavanaugh and her son, that's March's son, Avery's grandson, Sean Kavanaugh, are both professional artists to this day. This group of 3 works is currently on long-term loan to the Bennington Museum and is on view in our center gallery, provides insight into Avery's artistic process. Avery drew incessantly, and his quick sketches of the landscape and daily activities he observed around him paradoxically seem to be both loosely drawn cursory notes and highly descriptive naturalistic renderings. You can see the drawing for these 2 later works at the upper left. Often they were inscribed with notations intended to remind himself later of a specific color or atmospheric effect or interpret a vague or roughly suggested form. Avery's drawings then served as the raw material for his creative process. Taking them back to his makeshift Vermont studio, which I mentioned earlier, he would distill them into works intended for public consumption, especially his large, loosely executed watercolors. At the end of a summer's work, the drawings and watercolors returned with Avery to his New York studio, where they were translated into oil paintings during the winter months, sometimes years after the works on paper that served as their inspiration. In translating his initial sketch into the oil painting Two Women and Child, which we see at the upper right, both from 1936, the artist distills and simplifies, reducing the composition to a few broad, blocky forms and eliminating the figures standing behind the central rock. You can see in that drawing, and maybe more readily in the print which came later, the figure which is standing behind the rock is eliminated from the painting. That figure reappears in the Dry Point Summer Holiday, which was executed 3 years later. So again, he's kind of always riffling through his drawings and sketches and rethinking compositions and turning them into new media. At the bottom of the sheet with this sketch, and I actually cropped that drawing for this presentation, there's another sketch below it. And then below that second sketch, the artist experimented with writing his name backwards. Which is a skill necessary in printmaking since the text scratched into the copper printing plate is reversed in the final print. So you see his name there, Milton Avery. He did sign it in pencil, but when he inscribed it into the copper plate, he needed to write his name backwards. So on the drawing, you can actually see him experimenting, writing his name backward. These 2 works, titled Pale Fields at the upper left, which is a work on black construction paper, and Musical Landscape, both date to the mid to late 1930s, during the Avery's early summers here in Vermont. Pale Fields is one of Avery's lightest Vermont oils, both in terms of its tonality and its paint handling, which is all the more striking then that it was developed from a gouache, Musical Landscape, which was executed on black construction paper, one of a group of related works that make effective use of the dark ground. A passage in the lower left of both Pale Fields and Musical Landscape is indicative of Avery's creative process. In the gouache, and you can just see this just to the right of his signature, down towards the bottom of that work at the upper left. The upper of 3 broad horizontal strokes of yellow located left of center at the bottom of the composition seem to have been executed with an unconscious quiver of the wrist. Yet positioned to the right of an area of reserved black paper, the passage effortlessly evokes a small group of unruly bushes. And Avery seems to have enjoyed the effectiveness of this apparently spontaneous passage so much that he took great pains to transcribe it into the related oil. So something that would have just been a quick flick of the wrist in the work on paper then gets transcribed into this area, which looks much more heavily worked over by Avery in order to capture that same effect of the bushes. Another group of 3 works brought together from 3 different collections for the first time since they were created by Avery in my 2016 exhibition allows a rare opportunity to witness the evolution of an Avery composition. The subject's transformation from a plein air sketch to a finished watercolor to a major oil provides insight into the artist's power of distillation and intuitive emotive color sense. The initial drawing, which we see at the upper left, in one of Avery's sketchbooks from the summer of 1943 is dominated by the distinctive craggy south face of Ball Mountain. Highly descriptive of the actual site, the drawing is dotted with subtly indicated rocks and stylized shrubs and trees, accompanied by color notations such as blue fir tree, you might be able to see it in there, and yellow-green leaves. At the upper right, a swath of parallel lines, the top one wavy, suggests distant mountains obscured by atmospheric haze. The linear quality of the drawing is carried over and at times even amplified in the watercolor. For example, in the addition of the unusually drawn clouds. And at the same time, the watercolor is enhanced by color, both delicate washes, such as the distant blue mountains at center right, which you can barely see, but there is a very light blue wash of to indicate kind of the hazy mountains in the background there at the upper right below the clouds, and stronger areas of local color, such as the yellow-green leaves and then the darker blue trees, which correspond to the notes in Avery's drawing. And these two works led to this painting. Everything the artist learned from creating the two works on paper was distilled 2 years later into the graphically and coloristically powerful final oil, which is less specific and yet more evocative of the subject than the two earlier works. You know, you can see, if I go back to that drawing, you can see kind of just above that large central tree where the rock is, you can really see a sense of space in the drawing, where when you get, by the time he gets to the oil, everything kind of gets flattened out. Removed in both time and space from the actual site, Avery could concentrate on formal issues, such as the non-naturalistic palette, including mint green, mauve, and gold, and the unusual use of autonomous strokes of Kelly green to define the upper ridge of the mountain, which you see there at the upper left. A pair of humorous and telling anecdotes told by Sally Avery about her husband's painting Blue Trees, which we see here on the right, provides insight into the highly effective tension in Avery's work between their formal qualities, their emotive power, and the artist's dependence on subjects drawn from the real world. In one version of the story, Sally writes, quote, "A woman looking at an Avery landscape with a blue tree, which had been painted from a sketch made near Peterborough, New Hampshire, said, 'I never saw a blue tree in New Hampshire.' Avery," this is Milton Avery now, said, "This was in Vermont." And then in another version of the story, again told by Sally, decades after the fact, this time more accurately, but equally evincing of the artist's capacity for a razor-sharp retort, tells of a business tycoon, specifically Roy Neuberger, quote, "who thought he'd like to buy one of Milton's works." Sally continues, "We brought out painting after painting, and nothing seemed to please him. After looking long and hard at a landscape, he said, 'That tree is blue. I never saw a blue tree in Vermont.' Milton paused, then replied, 'This was in New Hampshire.'" In fact, the painting, which Neuberger ended up acquiring, was based on studies executed in Jamaica, Vermont, looking south into the West River Valley from the slopes of Ball Mountain, into the area that is now largely occupied by Jamaica State Park. The real photo postcard, which we see at the lower left, depicts an almost identical view, showing the same distinctive bend in the West River, while making the artist's selective vision equally clear. Avery based his 1945 oil on a watercolor, River in the Hills, that he had created about 5 years earlier, in around 1940. And both the watercolor, which we see at the upper left, which is in the collection of the MFA at Boston, wherein the composition was settled, and the oil, the contours of the mountains in the background have been exaggerated. And the furthest rise, seen in the photo, eliminated, emphasizing the other peaks' rounded forms. As was typical of Avery's artistic process, the artist almost certainly began by sketching the scene on plein air during one of his almost daily adventures in the hills surrounding the villages of Jamaica and Rawsonville. He loved hiking and motoring the backcountry roads, as evidenced by the diversity and relatively broad geographic range of the scenes he depicted in his Vermont work. And I can say that definitively because, like I said, I visited this area for a weekend and I tried to go around finding his watercolors. It's difficult because obviously over the course of, you know, however many years it had been, 70, 80 years, things had changed. But there were certain things where, you know, you see that postcard from the 1910, so about 20 years earlier than Avery's painting. There's no doubt that that's what he was painting, and we could find some other places like the swimming hole, but based on even the identified, like Townsend State Park is a 10-15 minute drive away from Jamaica. So we know he had a car when he was here in Vermont, and we know that they did a lot of hiking, because a lot of the areas that he painted could only be accessed by hiking up to them. Avery cared less for the who or the where in his art and focused more on the what and the how. In his translation of the watercolor river and the hills into the oil blue trees, the artist maintained the watercolor's basic compositional format while achieving a more specific and subtle definition of space, atmosphere, and form through color. During this process, I imagine Avery asking himself questions such as, how does this pale periwinkle blue look in contrast to this smoky lavender? Or how does this crescent-shaped bend in the river with its accompanying copse of green trees look in relationship to the rounded forms of the surrounding hills? So basically, he's always basing it on reality, but he's more interested in the formal qualities. And I think that becomes even more clear when you look at these two works. So on the left is Thoughtful Swimmer from the summer of 1943, and on the right is The Swimming Hole, which we've already looked at from the same summer. That seated figure in the left, bottom left of the watercolor on the left, Thoughtful Swimmer, is almost definitely Sally. That's probably a depiction of March, the tall figure, as well as the one on the right. And you notice his daughter, you'd think he'd get her hair color right. But it's based on March, but the details only matter visually. Changing her skin tone to be more effective with the colors in the background, changing her hair color to be more effective, those were things that he would play with. Yes, they're based on sketches of March, but he would change the facts to achieve more effective pictures, basically. Blue Trees from 1945 shows the transition into Avery's mature style, exemplified by Avery's latest painting based on the Vermont landscape, Mountain and Meadows from 1960, which we see at the lower right, which is characterized by bright colors deployed in broad patches chosen for their compositional and emotional impact rather than to describe observed reality. In the 15 years since his last major forays into depicting the Vermont landscape on canvas, Avery has purged his work of associative patterning with all its references to the real world and reached a beautiful, achingly tenuous balance between representation and abstraction that has come to define his work in the popular imagination. So very similar compositions painted 15 years apart. This we know is based on a drive through Vermont in the summer of 1958. The painting was executed in 1960. You can see that he's taken out all of that kind of the brushy linear elements that you see in the trees in the foreground there and the work at the upper left, and kind of distilled things down to their most basic elements, which is really typical of his later work. But before we look more closely at Avery's later work and its influence on a younger generation of artists, first we need to look backwards. This painting of nude bathers, or semi-nude bathers, or a nude bather at least, in the water, is emblematic of Avery's intentionally awkward figures of the 1930s, brusquely painted and dramatically outlined in black. The image is based upon a sketch that the artist executed while he and his family enjoyed a swimming hole with fellow artist Adolf Gottlieb and his family, who visited the Averys in Vermont during the summer of 1937. So we see that Avery's painting down at the lower left, and at the upper right is Adolf Gottlieb's painting, The Swimming Hole, from 1937. Gottlieb and Mark Rothko, another artist whose name may be familiar, who would go on to fame as major figures in the abstract expressionist movement and predecessors of color field painting in the 1950s, were two of Avery's closest friends beginning in the 1930s, and were deeply influenced by their older colleague, especially in their figurative works of the 1930s, which we can see in this comparison here. So much so that at one point during the 1930s, Avery actually banned them from coming to his studio for a period. period. And here we can see that relationship where they're creating paintings that are so similar, it might be difficult if you didn't know that they were painted by different artists, based on both being at the same place at the same time and enjoying the same basic atmosphere. So at the upper left, we have another late Avery, not from Vermont. This one is based on a summer spent in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And at the lower right is an Adolf Gottlieb from 1963, appropriately enough for being here in Manchester, titled Equinox. By the 1950s, the flow of inspiration became more equalized, with Avery finding courage in his friends' increasingly spare abstractions, fueled by transcendent color and only a minimal reference to any forms found in the real world. So, you know, Gottlieb's canvases, as Rothko's, if you're familiar with them, didn't have any real direct references. You can still see, you know, the wine dark sea, the beach on the horizon across the bay, and the tangerine moon rising. But at the same time, if you weren't told that, if you weren't given the title, it's as close as you can get to a non-representational painting without being representational. So here again is Mountain and Meadows, which is the type of painting by Avery that has often been cited as relating to the development of color field painting, which after a decade of gestation amongst Avery's friends and colleagues exploded onto the scene in the early 1960s. Given Avery's long-term friendships with Rothko, Gottlieb, and other artists such as Barnett Newman, this connection is not surprising. However, by 1960, the work of those three artists was solidly embedded in the narrative of non-representation that had dominated the discourse about American painting for over a decade by then, while Avery, though widely admired by artists, critics, and the general public alike, was harder to classify due to his dogged commitment to observed reality. But by the early 1960s, the cycle of mutual inspiration between Avery and the younger generation of color field painters came full circle, a phenomenon clearly visible on a comparison between Avery's work of this period, exemplified by Mountains and Meadow, and a series of watercolors executed by Paul Feely in Spain and Greece. Feely is not as well known today as Rothko, Gottlieb, or Newman, but he played a pivotal role in the complex narrative of post-painterly abstraction in America during the 1950s and 1960s. Feely, who was head of the visual arts department at Bennington College during the post-war years until his untimely death in 1966, was revered by his student Helen Frankenthaler, whose use of thinned oil paints on unprimed canvas is often cited as the origin of color field painting. Feely was also integral in organizing a series of exhibitions at Bennington College, including the first retrospectives of Jackson Pollock in 1952, Adolf Gottlieb in 1954, and Barnett Newman in 1958, and creating a faculty and creative environment in and around Bennington during the early to mid-1960s that reads like a who's who of the emerging color field and proto-minimalist trends that were happening in America at the time. Though Feely had largely purged direct representational elements from his art by the early 1950s, in 1961 he executed a series of landscape-based abstractions while on vacation in Spain and Greece, such as the one on the right, which parallel the razor-thin edge Avery's work had recently achieved in their tenuous balance between abstraction and representation. These works almost certainly owe a great deal to Feely's direct encounter with Avery's art, as Bennington College hosted a major retrospective of Avery's work, March 28th to April 17th, 1960, a traveling exhibition that premiered at the Whitney Museum of American Art and was seen at 16 other venues across the country. Avery's inspiration to Feely is hard to deny when looking at the untitled watercolor based on his encounter with the Greek landscape during the summer of 1962. Feely has reduced the landscape to just 4 distinct shapes, distinguished from one another with undulating string-like lines of unpainted paper, and defined by just 3 colors of lovingly applied transparent watercolor wash. As in Avery's Mountain and Meadows, the earth and sky nearly melt into one another. And you can actually see in Avery's painting that he painted over the very far left corner of the mountain so that they kind of do almost melt into one another. Avery really kind of became a touchstone for the artists in the 1960s, like Feely. So in conclusion, after decades of hard focused work and only moderate success, Avery established a major reputation in the American art world at the very end of his most productive time in Vermont. His first solo museum show was held at the Phillips Collection in 1943, after his long extended last summer in Vermont. And that was the same year he began to be represented by the gallerist Paul Rosenberg, who was one of the most respected dealers of progressive painting in America at the time. After a period of widespread recognition by the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, with the rise of quote-unquote pure abstraction, he was again looked at askance. Following his own path and never giving in to popular trends, by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, he was once again lauded as he pushed the boundaries between abstraction and observed reality. So a close examination of his work as it relates to Vermont, both directly in the abundant oils, watercolors, and drawings he based on observation of the Green Mountain State's picturesque landscape, including one of his earlier works from 1935, which we saw earlier, Fall Landscape, and Mountain and Meadows at the bottom right from 1960, and indirectly in the relationship between his late paintings and color field paintings with its many deep ties to Bennington College, help us to better understand his rare contribution to the history of 20th century American painting. Thank you.